All of the newspapers this morning talking about the possibility of power blackouts and that we've really got to get ready for them and learn how to cope with it this winter. Do you think it's likely, or is it a really, really worst case scenario?
It's between those two. It's by certainly not the most likely scenario. Every year, the National Grid, usually to not much fanfare, does this sort of planning. It looks at a number of possibilities depending on how cold the winter is, whether you might get interruptions, say, to gas supply, whether there might be very low wind speeds, so we didn't have terribly much wind power available, and come up with likelihoods of or a variety of possibilities and how they would respond to them. It is true that it's tighter this year than it's been probably for decades, particularly because of the crisis in Ukraine and the response of OPEC by cutting back on oil production, which will have some knock-on effect with gas. It is more likely this coming year than it has been for a long time, but it is still not the most likely scenario. But power cuts are so damaging. You have to reboot your whole house these days if you get a fairly short power cut. If they're prolonged, then you can lose transportation. Heaven forbid, you can lose power to hospitals and so on. So you do need to make this sort of planning, even if it turns out that the worst case scenario didn't occur. And so, yeah, unlikely, but possible.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we all sort of reflect back to the 70s and what happened then and how we got through it. But, of course, it's a different world now. So much of our industry, so much of our economy is based on the internet. And if all that goes down with a power cut, it's a whole different ballgame.
That's completely right. And it's further than that. To get the petrol out of the pumps now, a petrol pump is an electronic machine that requires electricity in a way that in the past, around the 70s, the last big crisis, you could get at fuel much more easily because electricity wasn't as all-pervading as it is. And so it's both the fact that it's much more damaging if you get the interruption in real time, but also it takes a long time to recover. I remember when there was power cuts to the tube in London, a little while ago now. The actual power cut itself was 3/4 of an hour, but it took over 2 hours to reboot all of the computers and get the tube trains running again at a time when people were stuck underground in many cases. So electricity cuts have always been serious, but that's become more and more so as our whole economy has changed and electricity has become so much more central.
Yes, and of course we're also internet dependent now, aren't we? Not just for our businesses, although that's terribly important, but just for our very lifestyle.
Yes, that's right. I mean, which is why I think we do need to have some public advice and public discussion saying, not to frighten people, but just to say, if you are told, and the plan is you'll be told the day before that there's a power cut of up to 3 hours, it's worth pointing out now, your fridge and your freezer aren't going to be affected by that. They're perfectly capable of keeping food cool for 3 hours, so you don't need to worry about that. But you might want to think about what power are you using, likely to be using at that time. Can you get ready for it? So, for example, you're not in the middle of doing some work on a computer and you suddenly lose it all because the power goes out. So just some basic advice around that sort of thing. Pretty much every country in the world, apart from the UK, is giving that sort of advice now. And it does work. In Japan, after the great earthquake in 2011, when they had real power difficulties for a while, they did have a big campaign which led to a 15% reduction in electricity, which meant they had no enforced power cuts apart from in the immediate area of the earthquake at a very, very stressful time. These campaigns do work, and I, for the life of me, can't work out why the government isn't prepared to invest and put the resources into one.
What sort of contingency planning? It's all well and good us talking about our contingency planning, but what contingency does A, the National Grid put in place, but B, all the suppliers, everybody else, businesses and all the people who are so desperate for it?
Well, the grid has a pecking order of loads that it has to protect. Public services obviously come first. We need water to continue to be pumped into our homes, for example. That uses electricity. We need to protect the transport systems. We need to protect our hospitals. Then domestic customers come next, and then industry. tends to be the one where the cuts would be landed first, because in the short term that's likely to do the least damage. So the grid will have this long-term contingency plan of grading loads, and if there is a shortage, taking off the least damaging loads first and then going down that pecking order. In terms of the power companies, which depend on gas, they will be in a position of making sure that they have some backup capacity. One of the measures the government's taken, for example, is keeping some of our coal stations available. They were slated to close for this winter, keeping those available. So there will be some backup capacity there if things do get really, really serious on the gas front. And there will also be a number of measures that individual firms will have taken to manage, as long as they have a bit of notice over it, which they should have. They can manage power cuts by laying off the workforce, saying, right, don't come in tomorrow afternoon, we're going to be without power, making sure that safety equipment is in a position that it can withstand power outages. So a lot of people out there and a lot of companies and organisations will be thinking about this very seriously, because an unplanned power cut a planned power cut is bad enough, but an unplanned power cut can be really quite devastating.
So, I mean, why do you think the government is at the moment ruling out any idea of a public information campaign? Because just if every one of us turned the lights off that we don't need and took other energy-saving advice, it would make a big difference, wouldn't it?
That's right. I mean, I think the government is saying, firstly, the price is making us take energy a lot more seriously anyway, and that's certainly true. I think many people are really looking at their wastage of energy, and that's an entirely good thing. But I think there's also an ideological thing about not being a nanny state. And that's really, in my mind, not what this is about. Some things, like you say, switching off lights are obvious, and you probably don't need a public information film around it. But pointing out to people that, for example, the best temperature for your thermostat might be around, I don't know, whatever figure fits the things, but say 19 or 20 degrees. That's not self-evident to everybody. And putting that sort of information around, saying house will be warm enough at those levels, but you will save a considerable amount of energy, both for your bills and for the national demand. That seems to me, as I say, something that countries all over the world are doing at the moment in partnership with their populations. And I think the government's view of saying we don't want to talk down to people, that, to my mind, isn't what we're talking about here. It's a partnership. We're facing a very serious national position that affects us as individuals and as a country. And it seems to me perfectly sensible that the government should forge that partnership with the people to make sure we've all got the best information available, so we protect our own bills, our own power supplies at home, and the national power supply by not using energy when we don't need to.